Cultural Development, Louisiana Main Street, and Atchafalaya National Heritage Area. Next slide, please. So our agency is the Louisiana Office of Cultural Development, and several of our programs have partnered to bring you this webinar series. I want to recognize the Louisiana Division of the Arts. I am Assistant Director of Louisiana Main Street, and from Atchafalaya National Heritage Area, we have Caroline Byrne-Casson, who is Assistant Director. And Caroline will be monitoring the chat today. Next slide. And before I introduce our panelists, I wanted to highlight something that we covered in our last webinar. This is the Airtable database that Caroline with Atchafalaya National Heritage Area maintains. This database lists grant opportunities by category, like arts and culture, historic preservation, economic development, etc. So this is a great resource to do some initial research and narrow down grant opportunities that might be a good fit for your project. So I'll ask Caroline to drop a link to this. This database is online, so I'll ask her to drop a link to that in the chat. And now I'd like to introduce our grant writing experts for today. Liz Goad is currently the grant writer at the Center for Planning Excellence, CPEX. She has more than a decade of experience in nonprofit fundraising, advocacy, and administration. She previously served as Director of Grants and Community Development at the Arts Council of Greater Baton Rouge. Beryl Gomez spent 35 years in the telecommunications industry, but she never did grants until she retired. She serves as grant writer and secretary treasurer of the Assumption Parish Recreation District. And as a community volunteer, she has secured millions of dollars of funding for the Pierre Part Belle River Museum, including grants, capital outlay dollars, and sponsorships. Jessica Kemp serves as vice president of CPEX, where she provides leadership to further its mission and resource development efforts. Jessica's professional and academic career has been focused on research, communications, fund development, and social justice philanthropy. And she previously served as VP of Communications for the Foundation for Louisiana. So thank you all for participating in this discussion today. And with no further ado, we're gonna get started. So I'm going to direct this question to Liz and then to each of the other panelists. Our topic today is writing a grant. So what is your #1 piece of advice when you're writing a grant application?
Oh man, starting strong out of the gate, Amanda. This one is so hard because it's really hard for me to narrow it down to one piece of advice. So I'll cheat and I'll give you two. Okay. And it's the bookends of the proposal process. So #1 is deciding, should you even apply for this proposal? Is this a good fit? Does it align with your mission? Do you have the capacity to carry out this program? And is it a good return on your time investment? I think the instinct is to want to go for every single thing, but if you're limited in your resources, it just may not be a good fit. So that's the first thing I start with, is should we even apply? And then at the very end of the process is having someone review your work, always, preferably somebody outside of your organization. It's really hard to objectively view the merits of your proposal when you're so deeply ingrained in that process. You're really passionate about the project. You want to make sure that someone who's a grant reviewer or a panelist is going to clearly understand the scope of what you're proposing, even though they may have never met you or heard of your program before.
So having someone outside of your organization look at your application is what you. Thank you.
That's right.
That's great. And I'll also direct this same question to Beryl. What's your #1 piece of advice for writing a grant application? Oh, and you're on mute.
Here we go. Thank you. I would echo everything that was just said. I think that you also have to know the community and the scoring of grants in addition to whether it's a good fit or not, because when you're going to tell your story, you have to understand, does it fit into the grant, and how the grant is going to review that. But I echo the fact that when you add a group of people working on that grant and the story and the narrative who are outside of the work you're doing, really cleans it up and gives you a good picture of how it's going to benefit once if it's awarded, and also the longevity and resiliency of that grant and how it fits in. So you can't do it alone. You need a village with you. I think everybody's knowledge is different. And since this is all new to me, I guess in the last 6 years, having the resources from others sitting in has been tremendous. And I would also add the number one is probably number 3 now, is to know the grant. Talk to the folks who are going to receive the grant. Listen to what their priorities are. Even find those in the state that have utilized some of the grants that can tell you what worked and didn't work when they implemented it, so you can sort of structure what you want that grant to accomplish. But yeah, it's a lot of fun though in the end.
Thanks, Beryl. And I want to ask one follow-up question on something you said about getting partners because you can't do it alone. So you're asking people to help you write a grant, which is kind of intimidating. So how do you find those people? And could you maybe give us an example? Or
I think when you've networked through the community and you're building what you need in the community, there are resources at every corner. As an example, a recent grant that we submitted included a principal, several school teachers, someone from the fire department, just to make sure that, and those who were associated in the view of the heritage. So when you get all of that together, and they had all their skills and all their knowledge about what, especially in the writing arena, you want to get your story written concisely. So I think it's easy to get resources. It just requires having a strong network base to know who to call on depending on which grant you're writing.
Thank you. And now I'll direct this same question to Jessica. So what's your number one piece of advice, or if you want to give us more than one, that's okay. Number one piece of advice for writing a grant application?
Thank you. This is especially hard going last, but I guess what I could add to what's already been said is to really know your audience and to have a very clear understanding of what the funders' objectives are, and in your proposal to be sure that you're very explicitly connecting the dots between the work and the outcomes that you are proposing and their mission and the specific objectives of their funding program. And I think so that when they hear the story of what the problem you propose to solve and how you propose to solve it and why it should be solved, they see very clearly how that helps them advance their philanthropic mission, whatever that may be. And I think it takes a little finesse to, sort of reframe the work according to specific, the same project could meet objectives of several different funders. And so that ability to sort of make sure that you're speaking to their specific mission as you describe the work, I think is really critical. That makes it easy for them to see why you would be a good fit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have a follow-up question for that too. So you talked about the importance of matching to the funders' objectives. So where do you find out what those objectives are?
Well, usually you can find them online. That's that's been my experience anyway. An established grantor or foundation is going to have their mission and program objectives online, you know, sort of like they have to tell their story and why they are doing the work that they do. And so I think most of that information is available online. And if you want to dig a little deeper, many organizations will also you know, have an annual report or some pages that list their past grantees and the kind of work that a specific program has funded, which also can help give you a really good idea of the kinds of projects that they see as a good fit for them. So I would look online first for sure.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. So I'll just put this question out to everyone, and panelists, please just jump in. So looking back on your career, what is the grant writing experience that stands out in your mind? And can you tell us what happened? This could be a good experience, a bad experience, a lesson learned, etc. So open that up to everybody.
I can start.
Oh, go ahead, Liz.
Sorry. Well, this is an experience from my first grant writing job. I was working full-time at a museum in Denver, and just a few months after I started working there, we were submitting a proposal to a local community foundation. And since this was a proposal for renewed funding, we had a relationship with this funder. It was general operating support, pretty straightforward. And my director felt really comfortable just giving me the reins to really take over for this proposal. I checked in with my finance director to get all of the financials that were required for that submission. And I sent it in feeling pretty confident. And we were all surprised a couple of months later when we got a letter of rejection from that funder, because one of the financial documents was just not the right one. They had requested a general, like an operating budget, and we had submitted something else. Maybe it was a balance sheet or a statement of cash flows. And it was a big eye-opening moment for me, because first I learned that I needed to really educate myself in financial literacy and understanding the difference between different financial documents. Of course, our finance director knows the difference between those two things, but he just made a mistake and sent me the wrong one. Ultimately, that didn't matter, because I own the proposal, I own the submission, and I'm the person who has to check everything before it goes in. So I need to know the difference and be able to check their work. And so, yeah, that was the big takeaway for me, is even though you're the grant writer, you're not the finance director, you still need to have an understanding of what all those different documents look like. And I mean, ultimately it was a happy ending. We applied again a few months later, we got the funding. Obviously I'm still a grant writer, so it didn't totally ruin my career, but that was a big takeaway for me.
Thank you, Liz. Jessica, were you going to answer next?
Sure. I have so many lessons learned, but maybe one of the biggest is to not wait too long, and in fact to start with reaching out to partners. If you're proposing work that requires, you know, coordination with anyone else, whether they would be receiving funding with you or not, and it's hard to imagine any work that happens in such a vacuum that you wouldn't have a community partner, and, you know, a governmental partner, another nonprofit. But engaging those partners very early on in conceptualizing what the project would be and sketching out what the parameters of the working relationship would be, who would do what are the roles and responsibilities. And even if detailing all that is not a requirement of the grant, just to have that authentic engagement early on in the process, I think is very important to the overall success of the project.
You can share other lessons learned if you want. I like hearing them.
Well, this kind of builds on what Liz was saying. Start with the budget early on also, because kind of understanding how you have to structure the budget can help you think about how you should describe, you know, the work that you propose in the grant narrative, and to make sure that those two things are aligned. I've discovered too many times after, you know, spending 90% of the time I had available to work on a grant on developing the narrative, that the budget was actually much more cumbersome than I expected, and asked some questions that it would have been much more efficient if I had had those questions in my mind as I was developing the narrative. And so, and also if you work in a larger operation, it might require cooperation of other people in your, you know, in your organization to develop that budget. And nobody likes to be, you know, asked like, hey, can you do this for me right now? It's due and it's due tomorrow. So I've certainly learned to give the budget a good chunk of attention early on in the process.
Amanda.
Beryl.
Yeah, I'll just add, coming from the start of never knowing anything about grant writing to get started, I'll always remember the lesson learned 2 years before writing the first grant, just going out and meeting some of the grant managers in person and hearing about what their grant offers. Is it actually something that we could pursue? Understanding the funding associated with it, in reference to how is that going to match the budget that the entity has to expend on the matches. And so, you know, it's not a quick thing. And I totally respect these grant writers who have so much wonderful knowledge and experience through the years. And we need more people like that, because I find there's a shortage in my area. But that was, to me, the education of, once we identified what we might need, to go out and understand what does it take, and, you know, how can we accomplish it, or we have fit, so we don't waste our time pursuing that, especially if it's a large grant. And then what I also learned through time is that not always is the grant scope going to complete the full project. There might need to be some additional grants to pursue, so that when it's finished, it's finished very well, and has its resiliency and sustainability for a long time. Because this is a big investment that people make in us when we are graciously awarded a grant to improve our community.
Can I jump in and just add one thing? Because Beryl reminded me of something, another lesson that's been learned, I think, the hard way over the years, which is to be realistic about your scope. I think sometimes we can feel like you know, we need the resources so badly to advance the work in our community. And like Beryl said, a lot of times one grant's not going to get you across the finish line. And I think it's important for the funder to understand, for the organization, you know, to manage expectations and to be realistic. And I know, you know, sometimes we've wanted to do this big project, and the grant is only for so much, and, you know, we try to kind of cram it all in there. And then we, you know, I just don't think you achieve the best results. It's stressful for your team. And I think it also is important to send that message to funders about what work really costs, you know, like what amount of time and resources are really needed to do quality work and to show up for our communities in the way that we want to. And so and you know, sometimes the funder will come back to us and say, you know, yes, we accept this proposal, but we're only going to give you this much. And so at that point, we've learned we really need to go back to them and say, okay, how are we going to adjust our scope to reflect that, you know, the grant amount is less, because we can't just do more and more and more with less. So that's, I think that's pretty important to make sure. And when you're finished with the grant, to be able to look back and do that assessment and say, were we able to stay on budget? Did this cover all of our costs, so that you can learn as you go along and maybe increase your accuracy in developing those scopes going forward.
Thanks, Jessica. And one follow-up. So you mentioned if the one grant won't accomplish your whole project. So would you say you can go back to that funder for their next round, like, and have it be kind of a phased project and say, hey, y'all funded phase 1. Would you want to fund phase 2?
I think that's a great question. And yes, sometimes, but I do think it's important, if you are saying like, we're only going to get this far with this, with this money, to have a plan in place, like how will you continue to raise money to see the project to fruition, whether it's, going back to that funder, or, have you identified some other prospects or possibilities that would help you move the work forward? That's certainly, that would be important to a funder as well, for them to know that they're investing in something that's going to, eventually be completed. And also, I think another important thing, most larger projects are going to have interim deliverables and benefits, and to be able to articulate those so that a funder understands, like, even if we didn't get to the second phase of this project, we still would have delivered, these benefits, through just this scope of work. So it's not, it's not like if it's not finished, then there's no value to it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Beryl, I want to go back to something you said. You mentioned 2 years before you even wrote the grant, you went and met with, I guess, the funders or the grant making entities. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, I'll be specific. We had, when I started working with our recreation board in 2016, they had developed a master plan of, actually, when the park was developed in 2002, they had a master plan, but they had not been able to reach it for lots of the reasons expressed here. Just the funding availability. And so, in order to understand what was out there, one of the grants that really stuck out was the RTP trails and land and water conservation. Because, when you look at history and you see what they were about, and you talk to other neighboring communities, and you find out, well, who are you working with and what has been worked? So it was those two identified first early on for me. And I was welcomed to come in person and sit down, and they were willing to educate me on what has worked with their grant. They're very passionate. They love what they do. They're as much into it as any grant receiver is. And so to hear their passion was so motivating, but yet educating. And even to the point of looking around at our area to see whether what they've done in the past we are a fit for. So I spent a good bit of time there with a lot of additional phone calls, and really trying to understand with our board whether this was going to be an option. And of course, they did educate well about the financial aspect. Be prepared depending on what you ask for, and there always are limitations. It just so happened in the year that I applied, that limitation had been raised and fully fit what we needed. But the relation building for me is what motivated me and made me feel like I could be successful at this. And so I decided to give it a try. And we're here implementing that as we speak.
I love that. Okay, I'm going to ask another question, and again, I'll just direct this to all the panelists. Like I mentioned, writing a grant is overwhelming and intimidating. So where should we start, and what's a good first step?
I'm happy to start. I had when I started grant writing, had a very formulaic approach to it because I came to it from my degrees are in English. I taught English at LSU, and I taught persuasive writing, which is basically, you know, how to construct an argument. And that's what grant writing is. You're making an argument for, you know, your idea, your project. And so I find making an outline kind of following the structure of a argumentative essay is a great place to start, even if the questions that the grantor asks, you know, kind of mix up the order. For me, it's really great to just help clarify everything in my mind by, you know, starting with a problem statement, and then what is the proposed solution to the problem? How do we establish our credibility? Why is my organization the right organization to execute this solution? Why is this solution better than other possible solutions? Anticipate counter arguments, and then, you know, describe your outcomes and how those outcomes are the result of the solution that you're describing. Another, you know, thing that is part of freshman persuasive writing that I think also applies to grant writing is to know your audience and establish that common ground. I mean, to show, like, look, our organizations have our missions are aligned. We have the same values and objectives, and, you know, and here's the problem we want to solve and how we want to solve it. So for me, having an outline, sort of a standard outline that is a starting point, is important. It's also important, I think, for helping the team brainstorm, because then as you work through that, you can identify, like, well, wait a minute, where are things maybe not matching up, or and to sort of identify, like, well, are we sure that if we do that, this will be the result, or are we sure that our organization is actually aligned with this funder? And I think it gives you an opportunity to answer some of those important questions before you've invested the time in trying to, like, you know, write something out in narrative form and make it sound nice, just to sort of work out some of those ideas in a rough outline first.
I can follow up with that. That's helpful for me too, starting with an outline and knowing what the actual message is before you start trying to wordsmith it. Mm-hmm. But once I get past that point, I find it helpful to make it a goal to write a bad first draft, because if I get hung up on perfecting the proposal, I just get stuck. And so if I just agree to make it sound bad, that's a much easier goal to attain. And then I can go back and think, like, well, this, I could find a way to say this better. I could find a better word choice here. This is a little bit sloppy. But that's how I have to start. Some people just, you know, the words just pour out of their fingertips, fully formed and concise and lovely. And that doesn't necessarily work for me. And also, I'll echo what Jessica said earlier, is if you start with all of the documents that are accompanying your proposal first, so starting with a budget, starting with letters of support, starting with all of the other support documents, whether it's work samples, whatever it may be, it makes it a lot easier to tell that story when you can refer to what those things are and you're not just starting with this blank page. I also just personally, like, get into, you know, an actual physical space where it's easy to sit down and write. One of my first mentors told me she has a favorite outfit for writing. And so if I'm working from home, like, I've got that sweatshirt on, I've got that music playing, and I just get myself in the mode to do it. And that, you know, that's kind of granular, but that's really what helps me.
Well, okay, I want to follow up on something you said. You said you get your support documents at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Can you
That's right.
talk more about that? Because that seems backwards to me.
Yeah, I always start at the end. and work my way backwards, because really, if I'm imagining what the strong proposal package looks like at the end, that's a huge component of it. And your narrative, I mean, it depends on the type of proposal it is, really, but especially like what Jessica said, if there's any kind of document that you're depending on from a partner, whether it's a letter of support or a CV or resume or some kind of work sample, if you don't have that in place, then you don't have a proposal. And sometimes those things take a long time. It's not going to be as much of a priority for them as it is for you, especially if you're the lead applicant. So giving people enough time, respecting their time enough to give them time to put it together, is just the best starting point for me. And then I can have that body of information to build what I need into the proposal. If I have to answer a question about staff expertise and how you're building your staffing plan for this project, it's a lot easier when you have their resumes right in front of you, and you can refer to kind of what their experience is and what kind of expertise they have in that area. Same thing with the budget. You know, you may have to end up rewriting parts of your narrative if you go to write your budget and realize that it's misaligned with the activities that you have outlined in your proposal. So all of those things kind of inform what you're going to say in your narrative and how you're going to make that argument. Really, it's, I mean, you know, show me, don't tell me. That's kind of a tricky phrase when you're talking about like writing a proposal, because you are telling someone, but the work should speak for itself, and you are just talking about the work in a way that is straightforward, concise. It is an argument. You're arguing for support, but it's not a sales pitch. Like, if you've got the program, if you have strong work, all you have to do is tell that story. So that's your evidence. If you don't have the evidence, it's really hard to tell the story.
Thank you. Go ahead.
If I may just add, listening to all of this, one of the things that I also found helpful was to do surveys. If this is a community impacted project, to just do groups and get input from them. What are your ideas? What would you like to see? For example, with trails, we met with paddlers. We met with those who might use those trails differently. And so when we got that input from the user's perspective, it helped to write that narrative and the strength of what it would provide to the community. So it just depends on the topic, but it's very easy to do public surveys and do group meetings with their backgrounds to help build the story as well.
I love that. And yeah, Beryl, if you want to speak to, the question was, writing a grant is overwhelming and intimidating. So where do you start? What's the good first step?
You know, for me, the best first step is it is an outline. Like, what are we going to need? And the documents really do carry a heavy weight, because if you don't have access to that, you're going to have to go develop that. And it's hard to spend all your time on a story without having the required documents ready. As an example, with land and water conservation, required an updated 6F survey, boundary survey. And we knew we had to pursue that. In addition, they'll ask for maps of different recreational parks somewhere, depends on your grant, but the letters of support, the needs of the community. So I like going after the documents first also. I go after the letters of support generally after I understand what the scope's going to be, because I feel like we have to let our legislators, whoever we're going to talk with and lobby with, know the vision and know hopefully the outcome. But it's definitely not easy, but I really feel an outline is what gets us there. And we can say first, second, third, what comes first, what comes second. And it works probably differently for all of us, but outlining that whole grants requirement so you know what you're getting yourself into really is a good start.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to direct this question to Liz. Given your background, do you have any advice for grant writing for nonprofit organizations and or arts-based organizations?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, definitely from my experience, one of the biggest challenges in the arts, and I'm sure it's this way in any sector, is just finding the funding. But I know particularly in the arts, the size of median art grants is about $30,000, which is lower than in other sectors. And really anybody who's done grant writing in the arts knows that you've had to go for proposals for $5,000 or $3,000, and it can just be exhausting. And overall, arts funding represents about 7% of all foundation giving, which is lower than other sectors. So that is tough. That's the first challenge to overcome. I know y'all addressed finding funds in another webinar, but that's just the biggest challenge for me. And I have found success by exploring funding opportunities in other sectors. So just kind of expanding, broadening the search, and thinking about how your creative program could intersect with other sectors. It really depends on what you're doing, but often there are ways to align with economic development, workforce development. Education is a big one, even health and human services. You don't want to creep your mission and start over promising and pushing into areas where you're not the best fit, but a lot of programs are already doing that, and that's where you can find an opportunity to make an argument about how your creative program can help achieve those goals for economic development or whatever that funder may be trying to achieve, and sometimes it pays off. I know that another big challenge is talking about outcomes and impacts for creative programs, which again is hard in every sector. But when you're talking about an art program or an exhibition or a performance, I know what an outcome and what an output is and what an impact is, but it's just going to be really hard to describe when you're writing a proposal for that kind of event. So a big thing is just knowing your funder really well and being able to describe what you're doing in a way that kind of aligns with their language. And again, don't overpromise. Americans for the Arts is, I think I mentioned it before, but again, it's a really helpful resource for some actual data about how the arts can impact those other sectors. And while you may not have the capacity to say, like, conduct a longitudinal study about whether these kids that you worked with are more likely to graduate from high school in 10 years, there is data that speaks to that kind of impact. And that is certainly something that is helpful in making the case in a proposal for creative projects.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to direct this question to Jessica. You worked at the Foundation for Louisiana. So how can our audience best connect with local or regional foundations, and how do they build those relationships?
Well, I should preface this by saying Foundation for Louisiana was kind of unique when compared to a community foundation like BRAF or GNOP, because they were both a grantor and a grantee. So they were kind of, I think what they called it was an operational foundation. But I think, both in my capacity at that organization and in my capacity at CPEX, where we're trying to build those relationships with those types of foundations, I think, Beryl spoke to it very well, that if you have an opportunity to build relationships with people who work there and get to know what their priorities are and let them get to know you and demonstrate that you have deep roots in the community, you have important capacity to share, and that you're a good investment that will deliver benefits to the community. I think that's really helpful. It's also, you could think about this from a media perspective as well. If you can connect with those organizations on social media or in your own communications, if you can be strategic and sort of highlighting values and objectives that are aligned with theirs to increase your visibility. So those with national foundations, it's it's harder. But I think it's worth, and they're all different, but because just the pool of applicants and relationships is so much greater, it is worth asking around, or like if you see on their website another organization in your area that's been funded by that foundation that you would like to build a relationship with, give them a call, ask them who their program officer is, ask if they could possibly give you an introduction, or tell you how they were able to establish a relationship with that foundation. Kind of figuring out a way that you can get a point of contact rather than just kind of submitting stuff into the info at kind of void, can be very valuable. And I would say the larger the foundation, the harder it is to be successful if you haven't made some sort of personal contact.
I agree. Thank you. I'll direct this question to Beryl. You mentioned your master plan earlier, so I kind of want you to expand on that and talk about how the master plan fit into y'all's grant applications and why having that master plan was important.
Well, first of all, the master plan from a board's perspective expresses their mission and vision to the people. In our case, we have a millage that the community pays into it for recreation. So it was really important to have a master plan to reach what it was the community that's paying wants to have when all is said and done. And then taking that master plan and determining what's going to be first and what's second. What do they want the most? And what does the board feel like we can accomplish for them? So it basically becomes the outline, and you look at that entire master plan about how is that going to be accomplished, and what funding sources that are possible for them. You just brainstorm all of that, and then you just begin working it based on priority 1 to priority 2. And we're proud to say that we're doing a really, really good job based on working from the master plan. There were no unknowns in the sense of what to pursue, what do we want to finish with, but the unknowns were, how did we accomplish it? How do you pay for it? What are the overruns and costs? Do you actually get there? But the master plan, in my opinion, is no different than a corporation's business plan. You have to know where you're going. And with that, you can then see where all of the opportunities, and that could be with sponsorships, with in-kind services, with grants. And so when you brainstorm, you can see where everything's going to fit. So I believe in that for any process that you're going through. A master plan, as small or as large as it needs to be, should be in place before you start searching for funds.
Can I add to what Beryl had to
Yeah.
say? As a planning organization, we couldn't agree more. And sometimes it's difficult to convince communities or entities to invest in plans, because it feels like, it can be expensive, and like what, people want to see stuff happen and materialize, and which I totally understand. But having a solid plan in place can help accelerate progress, can attract resources. And if it's done well with a lot of community engagement, that can be especially powerful for fundraising, because you have this demonstrated community support for this vision. And like Beryl was saying, it's so much easier for funders to plug in for pieces of that kind of help progress toward the vision, which is realistically how most plans get implemented. And then the community can see too, like, okay, we got together, we have a shared vision for what we want, and we're making progress towards that. And once you kind of see that incremental implementation, that helps build champions, and it just sort of has this exponential multiplier effect. And I think all of that kind of starts with the plan, and it helps you use the resources that you're able to get more efficiently, because like Beryl was saying, you see how to leverage, you see opportunities to leverage one thing into something bigger, and I think funders like to see that as well. So we're big advocates of having plans in place to guide multi-phase projects and to capture community vision and involvement.
Yeah, I love that. You plan the work and then work the plan. Okay, so we're going to move to our Q&A time, and I believe there are some questions that have been posed in the chat. Okay, so this is for the panelists. What if you know when looking at a grant that it wouldn't cover your needs? Do you still apply and show the full amount needed, or say that you are trying to receive other grants as well? Great question.
I mean, just from my experience, it really depends on the funder and what their specific requirements are in terms of whether you need to have a secured match, whether they're willing to fund 100% of the project, or if that's their preference or not. And some funders may accept a proposal where the matching funds are still pending. But I would say it always makes for a stronger proposal to have other sources secured, or at least be able to name where you intend those other sources of funding to come from. It's an investment that this funder is making, and if they sense that if you don't, if they sense that there's a chance that this project may not happen if you are not successful in raising the rest of that money, then they're just less likely to fund the proposal.
And to add to what Liz said, I think if it can be very compelling to a funder to say, listen, if you give us this much, it will help us leverage this additional amount of money, because then they basically, get to contribute to something bigger than what they can fund. But I do think that it's important to be able to make a compelling case, that leveraging those additional dollars is possible, that you have some sort of, even if it's not a firm commitment, you have some sort of reason to believe, some sort of evidence that is likely to happen. And I think another way to kind of hedge your bets on that is to, like I was trying to say earlier, is to be able to describe your project in a way that if you only get to do 60% of what the full project is, that there is demonstrable value in that 60%. Like, and if it were to stop there, it would still be absolutely worth doing. But ideally, you can also do this other piece that would then add additional value. But if you can think of it kind of incrementally in that way, and be able to articulate those kind of interim deliverables and interim benefits, I think that's helpful as well, because it makes it feel much less risky if you know that success isn't contingent upon factors that you can't control.
Thank you. And let's move to the next question, which is what tips do you have for approaching a potential funder for the first time?
I know. Just jump in.
I think so. And be genuine, just like let them know we've been wanting to connect. I think our missions are aligned. We're really excited about this work. I'd love your thoughts. I do think that the ask for advice before you ask for money is a good approach, to let a funder know that you appreciate their expertise or their partnerships, or whatever, that you would like to learn from them, can be a nice way to build a relationship before just letting them know that you're seeking funding opportunities.
I listened to a webinar yesterday that approached this same topic, and there was a funder on the call who compared it to dating, in that he recommended just trying to get into rooms where that funder may be, even if it's not something that's specifically related to your project. You know, if they're holding a conference, if they're having some kind of public meeting, just be there the way that you would be if you were courting somebody. You know, just try to be in the same space and get really curious about what they're doing. And that's just a good way to get to know somebody, to learn that relationship. Foundations are people; they're just individual people doing their jobs, and so it's like any other funding relationship that you develop. And sometimes it takes a while, and it takes a lot of touches before you get to the point where you're ready to submit a proposal or a letter of intent or whatever that may be.
Mhm. And this is Beryl. I would just add that know your sponsor that you're approaching, or know, have a little bit of background knowledge about, things that they've done, kind of like making it personal. I've learned or read about this has been accomplished and it's very impressive. How did you accomplish that? Something to have that person knows that, you've taken the time to get to know them a little bit before the dating portion.
I love that. Okay, next question is, do any of you have experience writing grants for fire departments or first responders?
I do not.
Yeah, that one's a little bit outside of kind of our area, but Beryl,
I don't, but interestingly enough, the coalition that we built here, bringing in all of the organizations of the community, trying to figure out how do we go after what we need and not be in competition with each other. And yesterday the conversation was, we need to understand what the fire department needs, what our business group needs, what our museum needs, what recreation, and all come together. And depending on where the funding is, we approach that not competitively, but oftentimes as, it might be two different applications, but the request is for both of them to be honored because both fulfill a particular need of the community and they enhance each other's outcomes, which we have practiced a lot in the last year and a half doing, because in the end, we help each other no matter what. And oftentimes, I'll give an example with recreation trails and the museum. Our trails are focused on showing the heritage that occurred in those waterways. And when at the museum, they'll show how the trails enhance the exhibitry that's going to be there that folks can go out and experience firsthand. And, the same thing goes with the fire department and the sheriff's office. We're putting an emergency pavilion in the park. Because of the disasters we've encountered and we're so isolated, we need to be able to serve the community. So without all of the elements in play to go after whatever it is we go after, in that case was capital outlay, we needed the sheriff and the fire department and all of us to come in together to explain the need for that pavilion, which we were successful in obtaining to be able to build hopefully in the next year or so. But yeah.
thank you. I think that was all the questions in the chat. So I guess if anyone watching wants to raise their hand, feel free. We do have a few more minutes. And Caroline, I'll just ask you to check if anyone has their hand raised. I'm not sure if I can see that.
I am not currently seeing anyone. Oop, Brandon has a
okay,
question. You see that, Amanda?
Go ahead, Brandon.
Hi, how are y'all doing? My question really revolves around one, as like community building, but also like that leadership kind of building for the nonprofit. Do you have any kind of suggestions or resources that you could share in that regard? Can you hear me?
Yes.
the question was community building and leadership building. That's a big topic.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes, I'm sorry.
Brandon, this is Beryl. You know, I would add in that community building and whatever is done that, you know, another important element is to be include your local government representatives. You know, oftentimes from a parish level in Louisiana, they have a wonderful master plan on their own. And we certainly want to make sure that whatever we're doing is in complements their efforts, and what we do complements them, and what they do complements us. And you know, they're a great resource too for community building, along with going into the different organizations that are very local to what you want to get accomplished.
Okay, that's great because I definitely I sometimes don't always lean on the state officials, but they're state officials for a reason. And I think the way that you put it helps me also like understand that there's probably some things they want to accomplish that aligns with what we want to accomplish.
Yeah.
I guess earlier I asked like kind of a two-part question, so my apologies. Do you have some additional resources for leadership building within the organization?
Is Brandon, sorry, this is Jessica. Are you asking about resources to help build capacity and leadership like within an existing nonprofit organization?
Yes, ma'am. I know it's not directly related to the grant writing, but I think that when we think about you know, kind of applying for the grant, facilitating the information within the grant, it does also involve a team or at least a few members of that team. And in which case, if those members can be empowered, it furthers the chances of success for the execution of the grant. Would you agree?
Yes, and if I understand correctly, there are resources for that kind of capacity building. That, and I don't know what region you're in, but that's a great thing to reach out to your local community foundation about, because a lot of them, I know the Greater New Orleans Foundation provides a lot of capacity building opportunities for local organizations. The Louisiana Association of Nonprofits, which I think goes by a different name now, maybe someone can correct me, but offers those kinds of things. So I think if you start kind of searching for, you know, nonprofit capacity building, you can find some of those resources and some of the organizations that provide them. There's even national organizations that provide that kind of capacity building. So I think it's out there.
Thank you, Jessica. And we are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to wrap up to keep us mindful of our time. This is the contact information for myself and Caroline. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. And I want to again thank our distinguished panelists. Y'all were wonderful. I was over here taking notes, as well as our attendees. And we are going to be offering these webinars quarterly, so please look for us again in the first quarter of 2024. We will be emailing this presentation out along with a survey for your feedback, and the recording will be posted to YouTube very soon. So thank you for your time and have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.